Woodsman disappearance at the morning checkup. This story is about a seasoned forest ranger who embarks on a routine patrol of the forest trails but mysteriously vanishes. Days later, only his belongings are found scattered near a strange, uncharted ravine. Since then, eerie phenomena such as distant footsteps and muffled voices have been reported around that area. The story explores the haunting aftermath of the disappearance, drawing listeners into a world where reality blurs with the unknown. The mystery of the ranger's fate is shrouded in unsettling details, designed to immerse and unsettle the audience, evoking vivid imagery of the chilling forest environment. I'd been a ranger for almost 15 years, and nothing about the forest seemed unusual to me. I knew every trail, every hidden path, and every landmark in the thick woods surrounding our small mountain town. The job was straightforward. Patrol, report, and keep an eye out for any signs of illegal hunting or forest fires. Routine, they called it. But what happened that morning, what followed, was anything but routine. It all began on an early autumn day. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the ground scattered with the first fallen leaves. My assignment was simple. Inspect the southern trails, check for fallen trees, and make sure nothing out of the ordinary was going on. It was the same route I'd taken dozens, maybe even hundreds, of times before. I wasn't expecting anything different, but I'd learn later that some things hidden deep within the forest only reveal themselves when they're ready. I arrived at the ranger station around 6 a.m., grabbing my usual gear, a map, my GPS tracker, some snacks, and a thermos of coffee. As always, I logged my route for the day and signed off with the usual note back by 3 p.m. The trail started innocently enough. The birds were active, their songs echoing through the towering pines. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots felt comforting, a reminder of all the quiet mornings spent out here, away from the noise of town. There's something therapeutic about being out in nature. It's just you and the forest. The kind of peace that makes you forget that the woods can also be unforgettable. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a point in the trail where I needed to veer off to the west and check one of the older routes. It wasn't used much anymore, too overgrown and out of the way, but it was still part of the job to make sure everything was in order. I radioed in, letting dispatch know I was heading off trail for a bit, then proceeded to push through the underbrush. It wasn't long before I started to notice that something felt different. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The air grew colder and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of being out here alone for so long. But deep down, I knew better. I continued walking, checking the old route for signs of erosion or fallen branches. My GPS showed that I was still within the expected range of the trail, but as I ventured deeper, the landscape seemed to shift. The trees grew denser, and the path beneath my feet became uneven. I was just about to turn back when I spotted something up ahead, a ravine, one that I had never seen before. I paused, puzzled. According to my map, there was no mention of a ravine anywhere in this section of the forest. Yet, there it was, as real as the ground beneath me. Its edges were steep, the walls lined with dark, jagged rocks, and a faint mist curled from its depths. The air around it felt heavy, like the atmosphere just before a storm. I had a bad feeling about this, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a step closer, peering over the edge. The bottom was lost in shadow, obscured by the mist that seemed to be emanating from some unseen source. I could hear faint noises, whispers maybe, or the soft rustling of leaves. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind. Still, the pull of the unknown was strong. I leaned in further, trying to get a better look. That's when I heard it, a sound distinct and unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere deep within the ravine. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the stubbornness that came with being a ranger for so many years, or maybe it was the irrational thought that I needed to figure out what was happening. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to those footsteps echo from the abyss, but I never saw anyone. The mist swirled below, thickening until it completely obscured the ravine's floor. The footsteps eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a shroud. I radioed dispatch again, this time my voice shaking slightly. I found something strange, an uncharted ravine. Doesn't show up on the map. Going to investigate further. The static crackled in response, but no one I tried again. Nothing. I checked my GPS, still functioning, but the coordinates showed I was in an area that didn't exist on the map. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe there was a logical explanation for all of this. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had settled deep, and I turned back, deciding it was best to leave. But as I did, something caught my eye, something glinting from the other side of the ravine. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, crossing the narrow edge that separated me from the other side. As I reached the spot, I crouched down and brushed away some leaves and dirt. It was a pocket watch, old and tarnished, but still intact. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The surface was engraved with initials. CLL. Those letters sent a jolt of recognition through me. I knew them. They belonged to a ranger who had disappeared 10 years ago on a similar patrol, never to be found. His case had remained open, unsolved, and his family had long since given up hope of ever. But what was his watch doing here, in a place that wasn't supposed to exist? I stood there, gripping the watch tightly, trying to make sense of it all. And then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, I heard something else. A voice. Low, barely audible, but unmistakably human. It was calling my name. I whipped around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and this time it came from the ravine. I stepped back, my heart racing. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. But as the voice continued, my resolve broke. I dropped the watch, turned, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. The forest felt normal again. The oppressive weight lifted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me. When I finally made it back to the station, I logged my report, but I didn't mention the ravine, the footsteps, or the watch. I didn't know how to explain it, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But as I sat there catching my breath, I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone out there. At something. Someone was still out in those woods, waiting. The days that followed were strange. I kept thinking about that ravine, about what I had heard and seen. I wanted to forget it, to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't. The forest seemed different now, darker, more sinister. Every time I went out on patrol, I felt like I was being watched, like the trees themselves were high. Then, about a week later, I received a call. A group of hikers had gone missing in the southern part of the forest, near the area where I had found the ravine. I knew the call would come eventually. The forest had a way of calling people to places they shouldn't go. Even seasoned hikers could lose themselves out there, but this felt different. My heart sank as the dispatcher gave me the details. And 3 hikers, all in their 20s, had ventured out for a weekend trek and failed to return. The search teams had covered the main trails, but there was no sign of them. Then one of the rangers mentioned a lead. A hiker had reported hearing strange voices near a ravine. I didn't want to go back there. Every fiber of my being told me to stay away. But it was my job, and more importantly, I couldn't let others walk blindly into whatever was out there. So I geared up, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out into the forest once the sky was overcast that morning, casting the forest in a dull, gray light, the kind that makes everything feel just a bit more oppressive. I radioed in my route, making sure to mention that I would be heading toward the ravine. My voice sounded steady, but inside, a knot of anxiety twisted tighter with every step I took. The walk felt longer this time, each minute stretched by the gnawing sense of dread that hung over me. The trees, once familiar, now loomed taller, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The birds were silent, the air still. It was as if the forest itself had frozen. Wait. When I reached the spot where I had first found the ravine, my breath caught in my throat. It looked different somehow. The mist that had once curled lazily from the depths was thicker now, swirling violently, like a storm brewing within. The air was colder, sharper, and I could feel a slight vibration beneath my feet, as though the ground itself was humming. I paused at the edge, peering into the fog. My flashlight beam cut through the mist, but it didn't reach the bottom. It felt wrong to be here again, but I knew I had no choice. If those hikers were down there, I had to find them. Taking a deep breath, I began to descend. The walls of the ravine were slick with moisture, making the climb treacherous. My boots slipped on the uneven rocks, and I had to steady myself more than once to avoid tumbling into the darkness below. The further I went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Right halfway down, I noticed something odd, a strange marking on one of the rocks. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but it looked like some kind of symbol, carved deep into the stone. I ran my fingers over it, trying to make sense of what it was. But as soon as I touched it, a wave of nausea rolled through me. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A voice, distant and distorted, like it was being carried on the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This place was playing tricks on me. It had to be. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something I wasn't ready to confront. I continued my descent, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. The ravine narrowed as I went deeper, the walls closing in around me. The mist thickened, swirling in strange patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if it were alive. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rock faces, and every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement, quick, darting shapes just beyond the beam of light. I reached the bottom, finally, and found myself standing in a strange open space. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of moss and dirt, and there, scattered around the clearing, were the hikers' belongings, backpacks, jackets, and water bottles, all strewn about haphazardly, as if dropped in a panic. But there was no sign of the hikers themselves. My stomach twisted. Something was very wrong here. I knelt down, inspecting one of the backpacks. It was ripped open, the contents spilled out. There were no signs of struggle, no blood or torn clothing, just a feeling of abandonment, like whoever had been here had simply vanished. I grabbed my radio and tried to call it in, but all I got was static. That's when I heard the footsteps again. They were soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the mist, but they grew louder, more distinct. They echoed off the walls of the ravine, surrounding me, though I could see no one. I stood up, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the fog. The footsteps grew closer, and with them came the voices. Low, murmuring whispers that I couldn't quite understand. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, searching for the source of the sound. But the ravine was empty. There was no one here. And yet, the voices continued, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't speaking in any language I recognized. But the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, calling for help. And then I saw them. They emerged from the mist like shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human. Figures pale and thin, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide and hollow. They moved toward me slowly, their feet shuffling across the ground, their arms outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to run. The walls of the ravine closed in around me, and the figures drew closer, their whispers growing louder, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they wanted something from me. Something I couldn't give. I tried to call out, to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. The air was too thick, too heavy. I could barely breathe. The figures were almost upon me now, their hands reaching for me, their eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped. The mist swirled around them, and for a moment everything was still. The footsteps, the voices, all of it ceased. I stood there, frozen, watching as the figures slowly dissolved back into the fog, their forms fading into nothingness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next, and I turned and scrambled back up the ravine, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs burned from the effort, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Something was chasing me, something I couldn't see but could feel, pressing down on me with each passing second. I reached the top of the ravine and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight lifted, but I knew I wasn't safe. Not yet. I made my way back to the station as quickly as I could, barely able to think straight. My mind was racing, replaying everything I had seen and heard. I knew no one would believe me. How could they? It sounded insane, even to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, that it had taken those hikers, and almost taken me too. When I finally reached the station, I logged my report, leaving out the details that no one would understand. The hikers were still missing, and as far as I was concerned, they were gone. I didn't mention the ravine, the footsteps, or the voices. Some things were better left unsaid. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the distance. And I knew deep down that whatever was out there wasn't finished with me yet. The forest had its secrets, and it wasn't about to let me forget.